The grand mansion stood tall against the horizon, an imposing structure that seemed to touch the sky. Its tall gates, polished to perfection, opened only for a select few. For the rest of the world, the mansion was nothing more than a distant dream, something to admire from afar but never touch. Inside, luxury and wealth thrived. The floors gleamed, the chandeliers sparkled, and the gardens bloomed with colors no one could find anywhere else. It was a world most people only ever heard about in stories. In this world of opulence, one person stood out, someone who in many ways had the keys to it all. But he wasn't someone who came from wealth, nor did he come from a line of noble birth. He was simply someone who had made his fortune from nothing, and in doing so created a name that people both feared and admired. The billionaire who lived in this mansion. He was known for his cunning business strategies, his generosity at times, and his arrogance at others. For most people, his name was a symbol of success, of everything they could never have. But for the people who worked for him, he was simply the boss. They came and went, performing their duties without ever asking questions. They knew their place, and that was all they needed to know. One such person was the woman who worked as his maid. She wasn't born into a life of luxury or wealth. She had come from humble beginnings, and her job in the mansion was all that she could offer to her family. Over the years, she had become familiar with every corner of the house, from the grand staircases to the polished kitchen counters. She knew her job inside out. Her hands were always busy, wiping down surfaces, tending to rooms, and making sure the house was spotless for her employer. It was the kind of work that was hard, but honest. Her daughter, on the other hand, had spent her childhood in the mansion, yet had always been an outsider. While her mother worked in the background, the daughter quietly observed the life around her. She had grown up hearing stories of how rich people lived and how they seemed to play by different rules. She wasn't interested in that world, not at first. She wasn't dazzled by the gold, the wealth, or the parties. But as she grew older, something about it began to tug at her curiosity. She was a quiet, thoughtful girl, the kind of person who kept her thoughts to herself but never missed a single detail. She watched how the rich people interacted, how they carried themselves with confidence, and how they spoke to her mother with a kind of polite indifference. Her mother always told her, "Don't ever dream of this life. It's not for us." But the daughter didn't listen. She was different, and deep down, she believed that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to break out of the cycle. One evening, there was an event at the mansion. It wasn't unusual. The billionaire hosted parties, dinners, and meetings all the time. The sound of laughter and music echoed throughout the halls, filling the rooms with a sense of excitement. But tonight was different. Tonight there was a sense of mystery, a certain edge to the air that seemed to suggest something extraordinary might happen. The guests who arrived, businessmen, celebrities, socialites, were all eager to hear what the billionaire had in store for them. It was well known that Richard, the billionaire, was fond of challenges. He liked testing people, seeing how far they could go, how much they were willing to risk. It wasn't just about money for him. It was about power, control, and seeing who could keep up with him. And tonight it seemed he had something special planned. The young woman who had been helping her mother prepare the food for the guests overheard a conversation in the corner of the room. She didn't mean to eavesdrop, but the words that floated across the room caught her attention. "Anyone who can solve this puzzle gets $100 million. Richard's voice rang out, loud enough to be heard by anyone nearby. She frowned. "100 million? What kind of puzzle could be worth that much money?" A few of the guests laughed. They didn't take him seriously. But Richard wasn't joking. His eyes sparkled with mischief as he held up a strange, intricate puzzle. It was a large wooden box with a maze of moving parts impossible to figure out at first glance. "This puzzle," Richard continued, "has been years in the making. I've spent millions of dollars on it. I've hired the best designers, the best minds to figure it out, and not one person has succeeded in solving it. So I'm offering a challenge. Solve it and the $100 million is yours." A few guests chuckled, thinking it was all part of the billionaire's eccentric behavior. Some even made a few half-hearted attempts at it, pressing buttons and twisting the box with no real understanding of how it worked. But no one was serious except for her. The maid's daughter, standing in the corner, felt a strange urge. It wasn't because of the money. She didn't know why, but something about the challenge pulled her in. Maybe it was the idea of solving something no one else could, of proving that she was capable of much more than what people assumed. Maybe it was the way Richard had presented the challenge, casually, almost like a dare. Either way, it felt like a chance she couldn't ignore. Without saying a word, she approached Richard. He glanced at her with a look of surprise, then smirked. "You think you can solve this?" he asked, his voice a mix of amusement and curiosity. She nodded. The billionaire raised an eyebrow but said nothing more, handing her the puzzle without hesitation. The room quieted as the guests turned to watch. They were intrigued but didn't take her seriously. After all, she was just the maid's daughter. What did she know about puzzles like this? But she was no ordinary girl. She had grown up watching her mother work, learning from the people around her. She had developed a sharp mind, an ability to think critically, and an uncanny knack for solving problems. She had always been quiet about her intelligence, never wanting to draw attention to herself. But now, standing in front of the billionaire, she felt a sense of determination that made her forget about everything else. The puzzle was more complicated than she expected. Its intricate design and tiny moving parts seemed impossible to figure out. But she didn't flinch. She studied it carefully, tracing the lines with her fingers, testing every move. Time passed unnoticed as she focused on the task before her. Richard observed her from a distance, still intrigued, but also starting to feel a little uneasy. He didn't think she'd get far. After all, no one had managed to solve it before. But there was something about the way she moved, so sure, so calm, that made him wonder if this time might be different. The guests, meanwhile, had lost interest. They had seen this all before, someone coming in with a big idea only to fail in the end. They sipped their drinks and chatted amongst themselves, completely unaware that the outcome of the evening was about to change in a way no one could have predicted. As the minutes turned into hours, something in the room shifted. The maid's daughter wasn't just playing with the puzzle. She was slowly, surely unlocking it, and with every twist and turn, the billionaire's casual smile began to fade. Something was happening here, something he didn't expect. The silence in the room was growing thicker, and the guests who had initially been amused by the challenge now found themselves shifting uncomfortably. No one had expected the maid's daughter to get this far. Richard, the billionaire, stood in the corner, his arms crossed, his eyes never leaving her. It was clear he was trying to remain calm, but inside something was stirring. The puzzle was his pride and joy. A challenge that had baffled the greatest minds, and yet here she was, moving through it with an ease that no one had anticipated. She didn't seem bothered by the pressure of the room. She didn't even look up from the puzzle. Her fingers moved with precision, shifting the pieces ever so slightly, listening to the tiny clicks and shifts that indicated something had changed. Every time she adjusted a piece, it felt like she was one step closer to unlocking the secret of the puzzle. It wasn't just about the $100 million for her. No, it was something deeper. It was the idea that she could prove herself, that she could show everyone that there was more to her than what they assumed. She had always been invisible to the world around her, a mere shadow in a house full of wealthy, important people. But this puzzle, it felt like her chance to step into the light, even if just for a moment. The guests, who had long since grown bored of watching, now found themselves drawn to the scene once more. They exchanged glances, whispered among themselves, but no one dared to interrupt her. They could see it now. The maid's daughter wasn't just playing around. She was determined, focused, as though nothing in the world mattered except the task before her. Richard's posture stiffened, his eyes narrowing. He had seen this kind of quiet determination before, but never from someone like her. In his world, people were brash, loud, confident in their wealth and power. But this girl, this quiet, unassuming figure, was showing him something he hadn't expected: patience, intelligence, and a depth of focus that most people lacked. He had always prided himself on being the smartest person in the room. His success was built on his ability to outthink everyone around him. But now, as he watched her solve the puzzle piece by piece, he felt a flicker of doubt. Was he being outsmarted by someone who had nothing to lose? Someone who had lived her entire life in the shadows? As the minutes turned into hours, the guests began to murmur, unsure of how to react. Some were even starting to feel a little uncomfortable. After all, they had all assumed that this was just a game, something to entertain them for the evening. But now it felt different. It was no longer just a puzzle. It had become a battle of wits, and the maid's daughter was winning. Richard couldn't deny it. She was close. He had seen her hands move with such precision, her face so calm that it was impossible to ignore. He could hear the quiet click of the puzzle as another piece shifted into place. The room held its breath, waiting for what would come next. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she reached the final piece. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers hovering just above the last section of the puzzle. The tension in the room was palpable, and even Richard, who had never shown any vulnerability in his life, found himself holding his breath. With a final, deliberate move, she slid the last piece into place. The puzzle clicked shut, the pieces locking together in a perfect arrangement. A wave of silence swept over the room. It wasn't just that the puzzle had been solved, it was that she had done it. The maid's daughter, the quiet girl who had worked in the shadows, had just won $100 million. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning, cutting through the stillness. Then, as though a dam had broken, the room erupted in whispers and gasps. People crowded around, trying to see what had happened, how she had done it. Richard stood there motionless, his mouth slightly agape. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The girl looked up then, her eyes meeting his. There was no smugness, no look of triumph. Instead, there was only calm. She knew she had won, but she wasn't gloating about it. She wasn't celebrating. She simply looked at Richard as if waiting for him to acknowledge what had just occurred. Richard's expression was unreadable for a long moment. The guests around him were eagerly awaiting his response, unsure of what he would do next. Richard had promised the reward after all. Would he keep his word? Or would he find some way to dismiss this whole thing as a joke? Finally he spoke, but not with the enthusiasm or excitement that anyone had expected. His voice was low, almost thoughtful. "Well," he said, "I didn't expect that." The room fell silent again, unsure of how to react. The billionaire's eyes moved from the puzzle to the girl, and for the first time there was a flicker of something different in his gaze. Something that could have been admiration, or maybe even respect. But he quickly masked it, turning away from her and looking around at his guests. "Looks like we have a winner," he said, his tone suddenly light. "You've earned it. The $100 million is yours." But as the words left his mouth, they didn't carry the weight they should have. It wasn't just about the money anymore. The mood had shifted. There was something strange in the air, an unspoken tension that Richard himself couldn't quite place. The guests, who had expected a celebration, were now unsure how to feel. They had witnessed something unexpected, something they hadn't seen before, and they didn't know what it meant. The girl, the maid's daughter, stood there for a moment longer, unsure of how to respond. She had just won a fortune, but somehow it didn't feel real. She wasn't sure what to do with the money or even if she wanted it. All she had ever wanted was to prove that she was capable of more than what people assumed about her. Now that she had succeeded, she felt both proud and empty. Richard noticed her hesitation. He had expected her to be ecstatic, to be overwhelmed with joy at the thought of becoming a multimillionaire. But she wasn't. She just stood there as calm and composed as ever. Something about her response puzzled him. He didn't know what he had expected, but this wasn't it. I don't know what to say." The girl finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I didn't do this for the money." Richard blinked, surprised. "Then why?" She shrugged. "I just wanted to prove that I could. That I'm more than what people think." The words hit him harder than he expected. For the first time that evening, Richard felt a stir of something inside him. It wasn't just admiration, it was a sense of recognition. He knew exactly what it felt like to want to prove yourself, to want to show the world that you could be more than what they expected. But her words carried a weight that he hadn't anticipated. The room remained silent as Richard processed her response. For the first time that evening, he wasn't in control. The game had shifted, and he wasn't sure what to do next. The air in the room felt heavy. The sudden shift in mood was undeniable. Richard stood there looking at the girl, the maid's daughter, as though she had just pulled a rug out from under him. She had solved the puzzle. She had earned the $100 million, but her response, the calmness in her voice, had thrown him off. He wasn't sure what he'd expected, but it certainly wasn't this. Guests shuffled nervously, unsure whether they should congratulate her or just move on. The million-dollar question hovered in the air. What would happen next? Richard cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. The crowd was watching him, waiting for him to say something, anything, that would break the silence. But he didn't speak right away. Instead, he found himself thinking. His mind was racing, shifting through 1,000 thoughts at once. Money had always been his currency, power, control, and wealth. He had built an empire from the ground up, outsmarting rivals, making calculated decisions that had brought him to the top. But this moment felt different. He had never met someone like her before. Someone so humble yet so smart. She wasn't dazzled by his money. She wasn't interested in his power. She had played the game on her terms, and now he had to figure out what that meant for him. "Well, you've certainly earned it," he finally said, his voice a bit too casual, trying to mask the uncertainty creeping in. "The money is yours, as promised. It's all yours." But the maid's daughter didn't react the way he thought she would. She didn't immediately thank him, didn't jump with excitement. She simply nodded, her face as calm as ever. She had done what she set out to do, and now it seemed like she didn't quite know what to do next. Richard, still unsure how to handle the situation, gestured toward the side of the room where a representative from his financial team stood, waiting to process the transfer of funds. "They'll get the paperwork ready," he said, trying to push the moment forward. It won't take long, but the girl didn't move. She stood there, staring at the puzzle box in her hands, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing its edges. She didn't seem to care about the money. In fact, she almost seemed lost in thought, as if her mind was somewhere else entirely. Richard's curiosity got the better of him. "What's going through your mind?" he asked, his voice softer now. It wasn't the question of a billionaire to a lowly servant. It was the question of someone who was genuinely puzzled, someone who was trying to figure out this girl who had completely upended his expectations. She looked at him then, her eyes steady and unwavering. "I don't know what to do with it," she said quietly. "I didn't solve this for the money." Richard blinked. The room had gone quiet again, and everyone was listening now. "Then what did you solve it for?" She paused, collecting her thoughts, as if trying to put into words something that she had felt for a long time, but never said aloud. "I solved it because people always think I'm just a maid's daughter. They think I'm nothing. I wanted to show them I'm more than that. I wanted to prove that I could do something, that I could be something." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment Richard felt something shift inside him. It wasn't the kind of shift he was used to feeling, the one that came with business deals or power plays. No, this was something different. It felt like he was being forced to see the world through someone else's eyes, and it wasn't comfortable. Richard had spent his entire life proving that he was more than just a self-made man. He had worked hard, clawed his way to the top, and along the way built walls around himself. He didn't let anyone get too close. He didn't trust easily. He didn't care much about what people thought of him. But her words made him stop and think. Maybe he had never really seen the world for what it was. Maybe he had only seen it through his own lens, where money and power were the only things that mattered. "People think I'm nothing too," Richard said, more to himself than to her. "I've spent my whole life trying to prove I'm something more." She looked at him, a small, understanding smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Yeah, I get that," she said. "But I think we both need to figure out who we really are, not what we think we should be." Richard stared at her, his mind whirling. He had never considered things from that angle before. Everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was based on his need to be seen as more than just a man who came from nothing. But now, in front of this girl, it felt like all of it, his empire, his wealth, his power, wasn't enough to fill the space inside him. The guests around him were growing restless, but Richard didn't care. This moment, this conversation, was more important than anything else happening in the room. He was finally seeing the truth. He had built a life that seemed perfect on the outside, but it was hollow. He had spent so much time trying to control everything around him that he had forgotten what it felt like to just be himself. I guess I don't know what to do with all of this either," he admitted, nodding toward the puzzle and the promise of $100 million. "It's never been about the money for me. It's always been about proving something." The girl looked at him with a new understanding. "Maybe we both need to stop proving things," she said softly. Richard let out a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words sink in. He had spent his life chasing success, but at what cost? And now here was this girl standing in front of him, showing him that there was more to life than what he had been chasing. Maybe it was time to stop running. Maybe it was time to figure out what really mattered. But before he could say anything else, the representative from his financial team stepped forward, interrupting the moment. "The paperwork's ready," the man said, his voice formal. "We just need her to sign and the transfer will be processed." Richard's mind was still reeling, but he nodded. Yes, go ahead." The girl looked at him one last time before walking toward the representative. She signed the papers without hesitation, but her expression was still distant. It was as though the money, the reward she had just won, didn't matter to her anymore. She had already proven what she needed to prove. But even though the puzzle was solved and the promise was fulfilled, something had changed between them, something unspoken, yet deeply understood. As the representative left with the signed documents, Richard stood there watching the girl. He couldn't help but feel a sense of respect for her. She had done what no one else could do, but more than that, she had shown him that there was something deeper in life than wealth or power. For the first time in years, Richard felt like he was standing at a crossroads. He had spent so much time building walls around himself, trying to protect himself from the world, but now those walls felt like prisons. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to tear them down. As the party continued around him, Richard stood still, lost in thought. He had never imagined that a simple challenge, a game for money, would lead him to this moment. But now that he was here, he knew one thing for sure. His life was about to change, whether he was ready for it or not. And in the quietest corner of the room, the maid's daughter stood alone, her mind already far away from the wealth she had just earned. She had won, yes. But in a way, she had already left this world behind, ready to step into something greater, something that had nothing to do with money or power. The following days felt different for both of them. Richard couldn't stop thinking about the girl, the maid's daughter, and the way she had reacted to the puzzle. How could someone who had just won $100 million be so calm, so detached? Everyone expected her to be overjoyed, to be thrilled by the windfall. But she wasn't. She didn't seem to care about the money at all. As for the girl, she hadn't stayed at the mansion long after signing the paperwork. She had thanked Richard quietly, then left the room without another word. It was as though the challenge itself was enough, and now that it was over, she was ready to move on. But Richard couldn't stop thinking about her. What was going through her mind? What was she going to do next? She had just been handed the chance to change her life forever, and yet she hadn't seemed to care. Richard, in the days that followed, found himself mulling over what she had said. Maybe we both need to stop proving things. The words kept echoing in his mind like a quiet hum that wouldn't go away. He had spent so much of his life proving himself, trying to show the world that he was more than just a man with money. But now he wasn't so sure. Was that all there was to life? Was success just about building wealth and power, or was there something more to it? Something he hadn't considered before? In the following weeks, Richard's world began to feel smaller. The meetings with investors and business partners no longer held the same excitement. The luxury dinners, the extravagant parties, it all felt hollow. He still held on to his empire, but now it felt like he was just holding on to something that didn't matter as much anymore. The wealth, the power, the reputation, all of it seemed so far away from what he truly wanted. But he couldn't pinpoint what that was. He didn't know what was missing, only that something was. On the other side of town, the girl was moving forward with her life in ways Richard could never have imagined. After leaving the mansion that night, she had taken the money, yes, but not in the way most people would have. She had deposited it into an anonymous account and then disappeared. She didn't want to be found. She had always known the world saw her as just the maid's daughter, someone without value or significance. For years she had accepted that role. But solving the puzzle had opened something inside her. It had made her realize that she didn't need anyone's validation. She didn't need the world to see her the way they wanted. She could be more than what they expected. She could carve her own path without worrying about what others thought. Her first step after leaving the mansion was simple. She enrolled in a small community college. She had always wanted to study, to learn, but she had never been able to afford it. Now, with the $100 million in her account, money was no longer an obstacle. She chose a quiet field of study, something that had always fascinated her: psychology. She had always been curious about how the mind worked, about why people acted the way they did. She wanted to understand people, not just the rich or the poor, but everyone. And maybe, just maybe, she wanted to understand herself better too. Richard had no idea where she was, what she was doing. He didn't know that she had started to build a life for herself, a life that didn't revolve around him, or the mansion, or the puzzle. He didn't know that she had already moved past the moment that had shifted so much for him. She was creating a future based on her own terms, not anyone else's. Meanwhile, Richard's life continued to spiral in ways he didn't expect. He had taken a few days off from work, something he never did. He had always prided himself on his relentless work ethic, but now for the first time he felt disconnected from it all. It wasn't just the money, it was the emptiness that came with it. He had everything he could ever want, but it all felt so unimportant now. He hadn't realized how much of his life had been consumed by the need to prove himself until now. And it was both freeing and terrifying. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, he found himself looking through old photos, pictures from his rise to the top, from when he had built his company from the ground up. In each photo, he was smiling, surrounded by people who admired him, but there was something cold in his eyes. Something he hadn't noticed at the time, but now seemed glaringly obvious. He paused on one particular photo. It was from one of the very first parties he had thrown in the mansion, back when it was just an idea, just a dream. He was standing next to his late wife, her smile radiant and genuine. They had both been younger then, full of hope. He could almost hear her laughter, feel the warmth of those early days. But now she was gone, and all that was left was the mansion, the house that had come to symbolize everything he had achieved. Yet it was empty. The house had never felt lonelier than it did now. Richard closed the photo album with a soft sigh. The realization hit him hard. He had spent so much of his life building something that didn't matter, something that couldn't fill the emptiness inside him. He wanted something more, something real. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the girl, the maid's daughter, had something he didn't. She had found peace in herself. She had figured out what mattered, and she had done it without needing anyone's approval. Richard knew he had to find her. He had to talk to her, to understand what she had done that he hadn't been able to. He had to know how she had found that peace, that calmness, that sense of purpose that he had been searching for all along. But how could he even begin to find someone who had disappeared so completely? How could he find someone who didn't want to be found? It was then that he realized something else. He didn't need to find her. She had already shown him everything he needed to know. The puzzle, the game, the challenge. It had all been a way for him to prove that he was still in control. But in the end, it wasn't about control. It was about letting go, about realizing that there was more to life than just the chase for success. In a way, the girl had already given him the answer. She had solved the puzzle, yes, but she had also solved something much deeper. The secret to living a life that was whole, not based on the approval of others, but on understanding who you truly were. And in that moment, Richard knew he had to do the same. He had to stop trying to prove something, stop trying to control everything, and start living for himself. He didn't know what the future would look like, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the peace that came from winning or succeeding. It was the peace that came from accepting who you were, without needing anyone else's validation. The phone on his desk buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He looked at the screen. Another business meeting, another deal, another opportunity to make more money. But for once, Richard didn't feel the usual rush to take it. He leaned back in his chair, took a deep breath, and smiled to himself. Maybe it was time for a change. Maybe it was time to stop proving things just like she had said. Weeks passed, and for the first time in a long while, Richard found himself questioning everything. The days were no longer just about meetings or deals or maintaining his empire. The world around him had changed in ways he hadn't expected. It was as if something had cracked open inside him, and now, everything felt different. His thoughts often returned to the maid's daughter, the girl who had solved the puzzle and walked away from it all, the girl who had not once asked for the $100 million. She hadn't needed it. She hadn't needed anything from him at all. It was as though she had known something he hadn't, something he was just starting to understand now. Richard had never thought of himself as someone who needed help. He had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, on being the one who solved his own problems. But now he wasn't so sure. The things that had driven him his whole life, ambition, success, wealth, seemed to have lost their meaning. What was the point of it all? What was the point of constantly proving that he was capable when, deep down, he wasn't even sure who he was anymore? He decided finally to track down the girl. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the puzzle or the challenge. He had to see her again, to understand why she had given him that strange sense of clarity, and why she seemed to have figured out something so fundamental about life that he had missed. He didn't have a plan or an agenda. He simply needed answers. After weeks of searching, he found her. It wasn't hard. People who wanted to be found rarely tried to hide. She had made a new life for herself in a modest apartment, far away from the mansion and the world that Richard occupied. The college she had enrolled in was small, quiet, and unassuming. There was no fanfare, no paparazzi, just the kind of place where people could be themselves without the weight of the world bearing down on them. Richard stood outside the building, feeling oddly nervous. He had faced millions of dollars in business deals, massive mergers, and hostile takeovers. But now, standing outside her apartment building, he felt like a stranger in a world he didn't understand. He was no longer the man he had been, and the strange thing was, he wasn't sure he even wanted to be that man anymore. Taking a deep breath, he walked into the building and up to her floor. He didn't have an appointment, didn't have an invitation, but he was determined. He knocked on her door, not knowing what to expect. After a few moments, the door opened, and there she was, standing in front of him. She hadn't changed much since the last time he had seen her. Still calm, still composed, with that quiet strength that had thrown him off before. She looked at him, her eyes curious but not surprised. "You found me," she said, almost as if she had been expecting this. "I had to see you again," Richard said, his voice softer than usual. I didn't understand it before. I didn't understand you." She didn't invite him in at first. Instead, she just looked at him, waiting for him to say more. Richard wasn't sure what he was expecting, but this wasn't it. It wasn't the confrontation he had imagined. It wasn't the big revelation or the apology he thought he might owe. It was simply a moment between two people, standing in the quiet of an apartment hallway. "I've been thinking a lot," he continued, finally meeting her gaze. "You made me realize something I've been missing my whole life. I've been chasing success, power, wealth, but none of it really means anything if you don't know who you are, if you don't know what really matters." She said nothing at first. She just nodded as though she had heard it all before. "You're not the first person to come to that realization," she said softly. "But it's a hard thing to accept. It means letting go of everything you thought you were. It means facing the truth about yourself." Richard felt something stir inside him. She was right, of course. It had taken him so long to get to this point, and even now he was still unsure of what to do next. He had spent his whole life building an identity around things that didn't matter. But how could he start over? How could he let go of the walls he had built around himself? He stepped into her apartment, following her wordlessly into a small but cozy living room. It was quiet here. The noise of the world outside didn't seem to reach this place. It felt like a sanctuary, something he hadn't had in years. He sat on the couch, not knowing what to say next. She made coffee, the way people do when they want to make someone feel at home. She didn't ask him what he wanted, didn't offer him anything other than what she had. There was something so simple about it, yet so profound. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't trying to win anything. She was simply being herself. As she handed him the cup, Richard looked at her. "You solved the puzzle. You won the money, but you walked away from it." "Why?" She smiled, a small knowing smile. "Because I don't need it." "Not really. It's not about the money, Richard. It's about proving to myself that I could do something, that I could be more than what the world expected me to be." Richard sat back, taking a sip of the coffee. It was warm, rich, and comforting in a way he hadn't expected. "And now?" he asked. "What do you do with it all?" "The money. The life you've built." "What now?" She looked out the window for a moment, her gaze distant. "I don't know yet. I'm still figuring that out. But for the first time, I'm not doing it because I have to. I'm doing it because I want to. I'm not chasing anyone's approval. I'm just living." There was something in her voice, something he hadn't heard before, a sense of peace that Richard envied. He had never known what it was like to live without constantly looking over his shoulder, without constantly thinking about what was next. He had always been in control, always planning, always working toward the next goal. But now he realized he had never truly been alive, not in the way she was. She had something he didn't have, something that couldn't be bought or built. It was a kind of freedom that came from within. "I've spent my whole life chasing things," Richard said quietly, "but I don't know what I'm chasing anymore." She nodded, understanding. "It's hard to stop. It's hard to let go of everything you thought defined you, but you can't keep running forever." Eventually, you have to face yourself. You have to be okay with who you are, with where you are. Richard was silent for a long time, absorbing her words. He didn't know what to say, didn't know what to do next. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He wasn't sure what his next steps would be, but he knew one thing. It was time to stop chasing. Time to stop running after things that didn't matter. The girl stood up then, breaking the silence. I don't know what you're looking for, Richard. But I think you already have it. You just have to stop searching outside yourself. Richard watched her as she moved about her apartment. She had found peace in her own way, and in that she had given him a glimpse of something he never thought he'd find. It wasn't the answer he had been expecting, but it was the answer he needed. As he left her apartment later that day, he felt lighter, like a burden had been lifted off his shoulders. He didn't have all the answers, and maybe he never would. But for the first time, he didn't feel like he needed them. He was going to start living on his own terms, without the constant need to prove himself to anyone. And for her, the girl who had solved the puzzle, she continued to build her life piece by piece, no longer concerned with what others thought or expected. She had already won, not with money, but with the one thing that mattered more than anything else, herself.